Dedication and Chapter I of The Great K. & A. Train Robbery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The Great K. & A. Train Robbery by Paul Lester Ford. Dedication. To my traveling companions on Specials 218 and 97, this endeavor to weave into a story some of our Overland happenings and adventures is gratefully and affectionately dedicated. To Miss George Barker Gibbs, My Dear George: At your request I originally inscribed this skit to our whole party. In its republication, however, I can but feel that the dedication should be more particular. Written because you asked it, first read aloud to beguile our ride across the great American desert, and finally printed because you wished a copy as a souvenir of our journeyings, no one can so naturally be called upon to stand sponsor to the little tale. Should the story but give its readers a fraction of the pleasure I owe to your kindness, its success is assured. Faithfully yours, Paul Lester Ford. Chapter I. The Party on Special Number 218. Any one who hopes to find in what is here written a work of literature had better lay it aside unread. At Yale I should have got the sack in rhetoric and English composition, let alone other studies, had it not been for the fact that I played halfback on the team, and so the professors marked me away up above where I ought to have ranked. That was 12 years ago, but my life since I received my parchment has hardly been of a kind to improve me in either style or grammar. It is true that one woman tells me I write well, and my directors never find fault with my compositions; but I know that she likes my letters because, whatever else they may say to her, they always say in some form, "I love you," while my board approve my annual reports because thus far I have been able to end each with "I recommend the declaration of a dividend of % from the earnings of the current year." I should therefore prefer to reserve my writings for such friendly critics, if it did not seem necessary to make public a plain statement concerning an affair over which there appears to be much confusion. I have heard in the last 5 years not less than 20 renderings of what is commonly called the Great K. & A. Train Robbery, some so twisted and distorted that but for the intermediate versions I should never have recognized them as attempts to narrate the series of events in which I played a somewhat prominent part. I have read or been told that, unassisted, the pseudo hero captured a dozen desperadoes, that he was one of the road agents himself; that he was saved from lynching only by the timely arrival of cavalry; that the action of the United States government in rescuing him from the civil authorities was a most high-handed interference with states' rights; that he received his reward from a grateful railroad by being promoted; that a lovely woman as recompense for his villainy but bother! It's my business to tell what really occurred, and not what the world chooses to invent. And if any man thinks he would have done otherwise in my position, I can only say that he is a better or a worse man than Dick Gordon. Primarily it was football that shaped my end. Owing to my skill in the game, I took a postgraduate at the Sheffield Scientific School, that the team might have my services for an extra 2 years. That led to my knowing a little about mechanical engineering, and when I left the quad for good, I went into the Alton railroad shops. It wasn't long before I was foreman of a section. Next I became a division superintendent, and after I had stuck to that for a time I was appointed superintendent of the Kansas and Arizona Railroad, a line extending from Trinidad in Kansas to the Needles in Arizona, tapping the Missouri Western system at the first place and the Great Southern at the other. With both lines we had important traffic agreements, as well as the closest relations, which sometimes were a little difficult, as the two roads were anything but friendly, and we had directors of each on the K. & A. board, in which they fought like cats. Indeed, it could only be a question of time when one would oust the other and then absorb my road. My headquarters were at Albuquerque in New Mexico, and it was there, in October, 1890, that I received the communication which was the beginning of all that followed. This initial factor was a letter from the president of the Missouri Western telling me that their first vice president, Mr. Cullen, who was also a director of my road, was coming out to attend the annual election of the K. & A., which under our charter had to be held in Ash Forks, Arizona. A second paragraph told me that Mr. Cullen's family accompanied him, and that they all wished to visit the Grand Cañon of the Colorado on their way. Finally, the president wrote that the party traveled in his own private car, and asked me to make myself generally useful to them. Having become quite hardened to just such demands, at the proper date I ordered my superintendent's car on to number 2, and the next morning it was dropped off at Trinidad. The moment number 3 arrived, I climbed into the president's special, that was the last car on the train, and introduced myself to Mr. Cullen, whom, though an official of my road, I had never met. He seemed surprised at my presence, but greeted me very pleasantly as soon as I explained that the Missouri Western office had asked me to do what I could for him, and that I was there for that purpose. His party were about to sit down to breakfast, and he asked me to join them, so we passed into the dining room at the forward end of the car, where I was introduced to my son, Lord Ralles, and Captain Ackland. The son was a junior copy of his father, tall and fine looking, but in place of the frank and easy manner of his sire, he was so very English that most people would have sworn falsely as to his native land. Lord Ralles was a little well-built chap, not half so English as Albert Cullen, quick in manner and thought, being in this the opposite of his brother, Captain Ackland, who was heavy enough to rock ballast a road-bed. Both brothers gave me the impression of being gentlemen, and both were decidedly good-looking. After the introductions, Mr. Cullen said we would not wait, and his remark called my attention to the fact that there was one more place at the table than there were people assembled. I had barely noted this when my host said, "Here's the truant," and turning, I faced a lady who had just entered. Mr. Cullen said, "Madge, let me introduce Mr. Gordon to you." My bow was made to a girl of about 20, with light brown hair, the bluest of eyes, a fresh skin, and a fine figure, dressed so nattily as to be to me, after my 4 years of Western life, a sight for tired eyes. She greeted me pleasantly, made a neat little apology for having kept us waiting, and then we all sat down. It was a very jolly breakfast table, Mr. Cullen and his son being capital talkers, and Lord Ralles a good third, while Miss Cullen was quick and clever enough to match the three. Before the meal was over, I came to the conclusion that Lord Ralles was in love with Miss Cullen, for he kept making low asides to her; and from the fact that she allowed them, and indeed responded, I drew the conclusion that he was a lucky beggar, feeling, I confess, a little pang that a title was going to win such a nice American girl. One of the first subjects spoken of was train robbery, and Miss Cullen, like most Easterners, seemed to take a great interest in it, and had any quantity of questions to ask me. "I've left all my jewelry behind, except my watch," she said, "and that I hide every night. so I really hope we'll be held up. It would be such an adventure." "There isn't any chance of it, Miss Cullen," I told her. "If we were, you probably wouldn't even know that it was happening, but would sleep right through it." "Wouldn't they try to get our money and our watches?" she demanded. I told her no, and explained that the express and mail cars were the only ones to which the road agents paid any attention. She wanted to know the way it was done. So I described to her how sometimes the train was flagged by a danger signal, and when it had slowed down the runner found himself covered by armed men; or how a gang would board the train, one by one, at way stations, and then, when the time came, steal forward, secure the express agent and postal clerk, climb over the tender, and compel the runner to stop the train at some lonely spot on the road. She made me tell her all the details of such robberies as I knew about, and, though I had never been concerned in any, I was able to describe several, which, as they were monotonously alike, I confess I colored up a bit here and there, in an attempt to make them interesting to her. I seemed to succeed, for she kept the subject going even after we had left the table and were smoking our cigars in the observation saloon. Lord Ralles had a lot to say about the American lack of courage in letting trains containing 20 and 30 men be held up by half a dozen robbers. "Why," he ejaculated, "my brother and I each have a double express with us, and do you think we'd sit still in our seats? No, hang me if we wouldn't pot something." "You might," I laughed, a little nettled, I confess, by his speech, "but I'm afraid it would be yourselves." "Ah, you fancy resistance impossible?" drawled Albert Cullen. "It has been tried," I answered, "and without success. You can see it's like all surprises. One side is prepared before the other side knows there is danger. Without regard to relative numbers, the odds are all in favor of the road agents." "But I wouldn't sit still, whatever the odds," asserted his lordship, "and no Englishman would." "Well, Lord Ralles," I said, "I hope for your sake, then, that you'll never be in a hold up, for I should feel about you as the runner of a locomotive did when the old lady asked him if it wasn't very painful to him to run over people. 'Yes, madam,' he sadly replied, 'there is nothing musses an engine up so.'" I don't think Miss Cullen liked Lord Ralles's comments on American courage any better than I did, for she said, "Can't you take Lord Ralles and Captain Ackland into the service of the K. & A., Mr. Gordon, as a special guard?" "The K. & A. has never had a robbery yet, Miss Cullen," I replied, "and I don't think that it ever will have." "Why not?" she asked. I explained to her how the cañon of the Colorado to the north, and the distance of the Mexican border to the south, made escape so almost desperate that the road agents preferred to devote their attention to other routes. "If we were boarded, Miss Cullen," I said, "your jewelry would be as safe as it is in Chicago, for the robbers would only clean out the express and mail cars. But if they should so far forget their manners as to take your trinkets, I'd agree to return them to you inside of 1 week." "That makes it all the jollier!" she cried eagerly. "We could have the fun of the adventure, and yet not lose anything. Can't you arrange for it, Mr. Gordon?" "I'd like to please you, Miss Cullen," I said, "and I'd like to give Lord Ralles a chance to show us how to handle those gentry, but it's not to be done. I really should have been glad to have the road agents pay us a call." We spent that day pulling up the Raton Pass, and so on over the Glorietta Pass down to Lamy, where, as the party wanted to see Santa Fe, I had our 2 cars dropped off the Overland, and we ran up the branch line to the old Mexican city. It was well worn ground to me, but I enjoyed showing the sights to Miss Cullen, for by that time I had come to the conclusion that I had never met a sweeter or jollier girl. Her beauty, too, was of a kind that kept growing on one, and before I had known her 24 hours, without quite being in love with her, I was beginning to hate Lord Ralles, which was about the same thing, I suppose. Every hour convinced me that the two understood each other, not merely from the little asides and confidences they kept exchanging, but even more so from the way Miss Cullen would take his lordship down occasionally. Yet, like a fool, the more I saw to confirm my first diagnosis, the more I found myself dwelling on the dimples at the corners of Miss Cullen's mouth, the bewitching uplift of her upper lip, the runaway curls about her neck, and the curves and color of her cheeks. Half a day served to see everything in Santa Fe worth looking at, but Mr. Cullen decided to spend there the time they had to wait for his other son to join the party. To pass the hours I hunted up some ponies, and we spent 3 days in long rides up the old Santa Fe trail and to the outlying mountains. Only one incident was other than pleasant, and that was my fault. As we were riding back to our cars on the second afternoon, we had to cross the branch road bed, where a gang happened to be at work tamping the ties. "Since you're interested in road agents, Miss Cullen," I said, "you may like to see one. That fellow standing in the ditch is Jack Drute, who was concerned in the D.&R.G. hold up 3 years ago." Miss Cullen looked where I pointed, and seeing a man with a gun, gave a startled jump and pulled up her pony, evidently supposing that we were about to be attacked. "Sha'n't we run?" she began, but then checked herself as she took in the facts of the drab clothes of the gang and the two armed men in uniform. "They are convicts?" she asked, and when I nodded she said, "Poor things." After a pause she asked, "How long is he in prison for?" "20 years," I told her. "How harsh that seems!" she said. "How cruel we are to people for a few moments' wrong doing, which the circumstances may almost have justified." She checked her pony as we came opposite Drute, and said, "Can you use money?" "Can I, lady?" said the fellow, leering in an attempt to look amiable. "Wish I had the chance to try." The guard interrupted by telling her it wasn't permitted to speak to the convicts while out of bounds, and so we had to ride on. All Miss Cullen was able to do was to throw him a little bunch of flowers she had gathered in the mountains. It was literally casting pearls before swine, for the fellow did not seem particularly pleased, and when, late that night, I walked down there with a lantern, I found the flowers lying in the ditch. The experience seemed to sadden and distress Miss Cullen very much for the rest of the afternoon, and I kicked myself for having called her attention to the brute, and could have knocked him down for the way he had looked at her. It is curious that I felt thankful at the time that Drute was not holding up a train Miss Cullen was on. It is always the unexpected that happens. If I could have looked into the future, what a strange variation on this thought I should have seen. The 3 days went all too quickly, thanks to Miss Cullen, and by the end of that time I began to understand what love really meant to a chap, and how men could come to kill each other for it. For a fairly sensible, hard‐headed fellow it was pretty quick work, I acknowledge. But let any man have 7 years of Western life without seeing a woman worth speaking of, then meet Miss Cullen, and if he didn't do as I did I wouldn't trust him on the tailboard of a locomotive, for I should put him down as defective both in eyesight and in intellect. End of dedication and chapter 1. Of the Great K&A Train Robbery by Paul Lester Ford. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The Holding Up of Overland Number 3. On the third day a despatch came from Frederic Cullen telling his father he would join us at Lamy on number 3 that evening. I at once ordered 97 and 218 coupled to the connecting train, and in an hour we were back on the main line. While waiting for the Overland to arrive, Mr. Cullen asked me to do something which, as it later proved to have considerable bearing on the events of that night, is worth mentioning, trivial as it seems. When I had first joined the party I had given orders for 97 to be kicked in between the main string and their special, so as not to deprive the occupants of 218 of the view from their observation saloon and balcony platform. Mr. Cullen came to me now and asked me to reverse the arrangement and make my car the tail end. I was giving orders for the splitting and kicking in when number 3 arrived, and thus did not see the greeting of Frederick Cullen and his family. When I joined them, his father told me that the high altitude had knocked his son up so that he had to be helped from the ordinary sleeper to the special, and had gone to bed immediately. Out West we have to know something of medicine, and my car had its chest of drugs. So I took some tablets and went into his stateroom. Frederick was like his brother in appearance, though not in manner, having a quick, alert way. He was breathing with such difficulty that I was almost tempted to give him nitroglycerin instead of strychnine, but he said he would be all right as soon as he became accustomed to the rarefied air, quite pooh-poohing my suggestion that he take number 2 back to Trinidad. And while I was still urging, the train started. Leaving him the vials of digitalis and strychnine, therefore, I went back and dined solus on my own car, indulging at the end in a cigar, the smoke of which would keep turning into pictures of Miss Cullen. I have thought about those pictures since then, and have concluded that when cigar smoke behaves like that, a man might as well read his destiny in it, for it can mean only one thing. After enjoying the combination, I went to number 218 to have a look at the son, and found that the heart tonics had benefited him considerably. On leaving him, I went to the dining room, where the rest of the party were still at dinner, to ask that the invalid have a strong cup of coffee, and after delivering my request, Mr. Cullen asked me to join them in a cigar. This I did gladly, for a cigar and Miss Cullen's society were even pleasanter than a cigar and Miss Cullen's pictures, because the pictures never quite did her justice, and besides, didn't talk. Our smoke finished, we went back to the saloon, where the gentlemen sat down to poker, which Lord Ralles had just learned and liked. They did not ask me to take a hand, for which I was grateful, as the salary of a railroad superintendent would hardly stand the game they probably played; and I had my compensation when Miss Cullen also was not asked to join them. She said she was going to watch the moonlight on the mountains from the platform, and opened the door to go out, finding for the first time that number 97 was the ender. In her disappointment she protested against this, and wanted to know the why and wherefore. "We shall have far less motion, Madge," Mr. Cullen explained, "and then we sha'n't have the rear end man in our car at night." "But I don't mind the motion," urged Miss Cullen, "and the Flagman is only there after we are all in our rooms. Please leave us the view." "I prefer the present arrangement, Madge," insisted Mr. Cullen, in a very positive voice. I was so sorry for Miss Cullen's disappointment that on impulse I said, "The platform of 97 is entirely at your service, Miss Cullen." The moment it was out I realized that I ought not to have said it, and that I deserved a rebuke for supposing she would use my car. Miss Cullen took it better than I hoped for, and was declining the offer as kindly as my intention had been in making it, when, much to my astonishment, her father interrupted by saying, "By all means, Madge. That relieves us of the discomfort of being the last car, and yet lets you have the scenery and moonlight." Miss Cullen looked at her father for a moment, as if not believing what she had heard. Lord Ralles scowled and opened his mouth to say something, but checked himself, and only flung his discard down, as if he hated the cards. "Thank you, papa," responded Miss Cullen, "but I think I will watch you play." "Now, Madge, don't be foolish," said Mr. Cullen, irritably. "You might just as well have the pleasure, and you'll only disturb the game if you stay here." Miss Cullen leaned over and whispered something, and her father answered her. Lord Ralles must have heard, for he muttered something, which made Miss Cullen color up. But much good it did him, for she turned to me and said, "Since my father doesn't disapprove, I will gladly accept your hospitality, Mr. Gordon," and after a glance at Lord Ralles that had a challenging "I'll do as I please" in it, she went to get her hat and coat. The whole incident had not taken 10 seconds, yet it puzzled me beyond measure, even while my heart beat with an unreasonable hope. For my better sense told me that it simply meant that Lord Ralles disapproved, and Miss Cullen, like any girl of spirit, was giving him notice that he was not yet privileged to control her actions. Whatever the scene meant, his lordship did not like it, for he swore at his luck the moment Miss Cullen had left the room. When Miss Cullen returned, we went back to the rear platform of 97. I let down the traps, closed the gates, got a camp stool for her to sit upon, with a cushion to lean on, and a footstool, and fixed her as comfortably as I could, even getting a travelling rug to cover her lap, for the plateau air was chilly. Then I hesitated a moment, for I had the feeling that she had not thoroughly approved of the thing, and therefore she might not like to have me stay. Yet she was so charming in the moonlight, and the little balcony the platform made was such a tempting spot to linger on while she was there, that it wasn't easy to go. Finally I asked, "You are quite comfortable, Miss Cullen?" "Sinfully so," she laughed. "Then perhaps you would like to be left to enjoy the moonlight and your meditations by yourself?" I questioned. I knew I ought to have just gone away, but I simply couldn't when she looked so enticing. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "No," I ejaculated so forcibly that she gave a little startled jump in her chair. "That is, I mean," I stuttered, embarrassed by my own vehemence, "I rather thought you might not want me to stay." "What made you think that?" she demanded. I never was a good hand at inventing explanations, and after a moment's seeking for some reason, I plumped out, "Because I feared you might not think it proper to use my car, and I suppose it's my presence that made you think it." She took my stupid fumble very nicely, laughing merrily while saying, "If you like mountains and moonlight, Mr. Gordon, and don't mind the lack of a chaperone, get a stool for yourself, too." What was more, she offered me half of the lap robe when I was seated beside her. I think she was pleased by my offer to go away, for she talked very pleasantly and far more intimately than she had ever done before, telling me facts about her family, her Chicago life, her travels, and even her thoughts. From this I learned that her elder brother was an Oxford graduate, and that Lord Ralles and his brother were classmates, who were visiting him for the first time since he had graduated. She asked me some questions about my work, which led me to tell her pretty much everything about myself that I thought could be of the least interest, and it was a very pleasant surprise to me to find that she knew one of the old team, and had even heard of me from him. "Why," she exclaimed, "how absurd of me not to have thought of it before! But you see Mr. Colston always speaks of you by your first name. You ought to hear how he praises you." "Trust Harry to praise any one," I said. "There were some pretty low fellows on the old team, men who couldn't keep their word or their tempers, and would slug every chance they got. But Harry used to insist there wasn't a bad egg among the lot." "Don't you find it very lonely to live out here, away from all your old friends?" she asked. I had to acknowledge that it was, and told her the worst part was the absence of pleasant women. "Till you arrived, Miss Cullen," I said, "I hadn't seen a well gowned woman in 4 years." I've always noticed that a woman would rather have a man notice and praise her frock than her beauty, and Miss Cullen was apparently no exception, for I could see the remark pleased her. "Don't Western women ever get Eastern gowns?" she asked. "Any quantity," I said. "But you know, Miss Cullen, that it isn't the gown, but the way it's worn, that gives the artistic touch." For a fellow who had devoted the last 7 years of his life to grades and fuel and rebates and pay rolls, I don't think that was bad. At least it made Miss Cullen's mouth dimple at the corners. The whole evening was so eminently satisfactory that I almost believe I should be talking yet, if interruption had not come. The first premonition of it was Miss Cullen's giving a little shiver, which made me ask if she was cold. "Not at all," she replied. "I only What place are we stopping at?" I started to rise, but she checked the movement and said, "Don't trouble yourself. I thought you would know without moving. I really don't care to know." I took out my watch, and was startled to find that it was 20 minutes past 12. I wasn't so green as to tell Miss Cullen so, and merely said, "By the time, this must be Sanders." "Do we stop long?" she asked. "Only to take water," I told her, and then went on with what I had been speaking about when she shivered. But as I talked it slowly dawned on me that we had been standing still some time, and presently I stopped speaking and glanced off, expecting to recognize something, only to see Alkali Plain on both sides. A little surprised, I looked down, to find no siding. Rising hastily, I looked out forward. I could see moving figures on each side of the train, but that meant nothing, as the train's crew, and, for that matter, passengers are very apt to alight at every stop. What did mean something was that there was no water tank, no station, nor any other visible cause for a stop. "Is anything the matter?" asked Miss Cullen. "I think something's wrong with the engine, or the roadbed, Miss Cullen," I said, "and if you'll excuse me a moment I'll go forward and see." I had barely spoken when bang, bang, went two shots. That they were both fired from an English express my ears told me, for no other people in this world make a mountain howitzer and call it a rifle. Hardly were the two shots fired when crack, 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 crack went some Winchesters. "Oh, what is it?" cried Miss Cullen. "I think your wish has been granted," I answered hurriedly. "We are being held up, and Lord Ralles is showing us how to " My speech was interrupted. "Bang, bang!" challenged another express, the shots so close together as to be almost simultaneous. "Crack, crack, crack!" retorted the Winchesters, and from the fact that silence followed I drew a clear inference. I said to myself, "That is an end of poor John Bull." Chapter 3 of The Great K&A Train Robbery by Paul Lester Ford. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3: A Night's Work on the Alkali Plains. I hurried Miss Cullen into the car, and, after bolting the rear door, took down my Winchester from its rack. "I'm going forward," I told her, "and will tell my darkies to bolt the front door, so you'll be as safe in here as in Chicago." In another minute I was on my front platform. Dropping down between the two cars, I crept along beside, indeed half under, Mr. Cullen's special. After my previous conclusion, my surprise can be judged when at the farther end I found the two Britishers and Albert Cullen standing there in the most exposed position possible. I joined them, muttering to myself something about Providence and fools. "Ah," drawled Cullen, "here's Mr. Gordon, just too late for the sport, by Jove." "Well," bragged Lord Ralles, "we've had a hand in this deal, Mr. Superintendent, and haven't been potted. The scoundrels broke for cover the moment we opened fire." By this time there were 20 passengers about our group, all of them asking questions at once, making it difficult to learn just what had happened; but so far as I could piece the answers together, the poker players' curiosity had been aroused by the long stop, and, looking out, they had seen a single man with a rifle standing by the engine. Instantly arming themselves, Lord Ralles let fly both barrels at him, and in turn was the target for the first 4 shots I had heard. The shooting had brought the rest of the robbers tumbling off the cars, and the captain and Cullen had fired the rest of the shots at them as they scattered. I didn't stop to hear more, but went forward to see what the road agents had got away with. I found the express agent tied hand and foot in the corner of his car, and, telling a brakeman who had followed me to set him at liberty, I turned my attention to the safe. That the diversion had not come a moment too soon was shown by the dynamite cartridge already in place, and by the fuse that lay on the floor, as if dropped suddenly. But the safe was intact. Passing into the mail car, I found the clerk tied to a post, with a mail sack pulled over his head, and the utmost confusion among the pouches and sorting compartments, while scattered over the floor were a great many letters. Setting him at liberty, I asked him if he could tell whether mail had been taken, and, after a glance at the confusion, he said he could not know till he had examined. Having taken stock of the harm done, I began asking questions. Just after we had left Sanders, 2 masked men had entered the mail car, and while one covered the clerk with a revolver, the other had tied and sacked him. 2 more had gone forward and done the same to the express agent. Another had climbed over the tender and ordered the runner to hold up. All this was regular program, as I had explained to Miss Cullen, but here had been a variation which I had never heard of being done, and of which I couldn't fathom the object. When the train had been stopped, the man on the tender had ordered the fireman to dump his fire, and now it was lying in the road bed, and threatening to burn through the ties. So my first order was to extinguish it, and my second was to start a new fire and get up steam as quickly as possible. From all I could learn, there were 8 men concerned in the attempt, and I confess I shook my head in puzzlement why that number should have allowed themselves to be scared off so easily. My wonderment grew when I called on the conductor for his tickets. These showed nothing but 2 from Albuquerque, 1 from Laguna, and 4 from Coolidge. This latter would have looked hopeful but for the fact that it was a party of 3 women and a man. Going back beyond Lamy didn't give anything, for the conductor was able to account for every fare as either still in the train or as having got off at some point. My only conclusion was that the robbers had sneaked onto the platforms at Sanders, and I gave the crew a good dressing down for their carelessness. Of course, they insisted it was impossible, but they were bound to do that. Going back to 97, I got my telegraph instrument, though I thought it a waste of time, the road agents being always careful to break the lines. I told the brakeman to climb the pole and cut a wire. While he was struggling up, Miss Cullen joined me. "Do you really expect to catch them?" she asked. "I shouldn't like to be one of 'em," I replied. "But how can you do it?" "You could understand better, Miss Cullen, if you knew this country. You see, every bit of water is in use by ranches, and these fellows can't go more than 50 miles without watering. So we shall have word of them wherever they go." "Line cut, Mr. Gordon," came from overhead at this point, making Miss Cullen jump with surprise. "What was that?" she asked. I explained to her, and after making connections I called Sanders. Much to my surprise the agent responded. I was so astonished that for a moment I could not believe the fact. "This is the queerest hold up of which I ever heard," I remarked to Miss Cullen. "Ah, in what respect?" asked Albert Cullen's voice, and looking up I found that he and quite a number of the passengers had joined us. "The road agents make us dump our fire," I said, "and yet they haven't cut the wires in either direction. I can't see how they can escape us." "What fun!" cried Miss Cullen. "I don't see what difference either makes in their chances of escaping," said Lord Ralles. While he was speaking I ticked off the news of our being held up, and asked the agent if there had been any men about Sanders, or if he had seen any one board the train there. His answer was positive that no one could have done so, and that settled it as to Sanders. I asked the same questions of Allentown and Wingate, which were the only places we had stopped at after leaving Coolidge, getting the same answers. That 8 men could have remained concealed on any of the platforms from that point was impossible, and I began to suspect magic. Then I called Coolidge and told of the holding up, after which I telegraphed the agent at Navajo Springs to notify the commander at Fort Defiance, for I suspected the road agents would make for the Navajo reservation. Finally I called Flagstaff as I had Coolidge, directed that the authorities be notified of the facts, and ordered an extra to bring out the sheriff and posse. "I don't think," said Miss Cullen, "that I am a bit more curious than most people, but it has nearly made me frantic to have you tick away on that little machine and hear it tick back, and not understand a word." After that I had to tell her what I had said and learned. "How clever of you to think of counting the tickets and finding out where people got on and off! I never should have thought of either," she said. "It hasn't helped me much," I laughed rather grimly, "except to eliminate every possible clue." "They probably did steal on at one of the stops," suggested a passenger. I shook my head. "There isn't a stick of timber nor a place of concealment on these alkali plains," I replied, "and it was bright moonlight till an hour ago. It would be hard enough for one man to get within a mile of the station without being seen, and it would be impossible for 7 or 8." "How do you know the number?" asked a passenger. "I don't," I said. "That's the number the crew think there were, but I myself don't believe it." "Why don't you believe the men?" asked Miss Cullen. "First, because there's always a tendency to magnify, and next, because the road agents ran away so quickly." "I counted at least 7," asserted Lord Ralles. "Well, Lord Ralles," I said, "I don't want to dispute your eyesight, but if they had been that strong they would never have bolted, and if you want to lay a bottle of wine I'll wager that when I catch those chaps we'll find there weren't more than 3 or 4 of them." "Done!" he snapped. Leaving the group, I went forward to get the report of the mail agent. He had put things to right, and told me that, though the mail had been pretty badly mixed up, only 1 pouch at worst had been rifled. This, the one for registered mail, had been cut open, but, as if to increase the mystery, the letters had been scattered, unopened, about the car, only 3 out of the whole being missing, and those very probably had fallen into the pigeon holes and would be found on a more careful search. I confess I breathed easier to think that the road agents had got away with nothing, and was so pleased that I went back to the wire to send the news of it, that the fact might be included in the press despatches. The moon had set, and it was so dark that I had some difficulty in finding the pole. When I found it, Miss Cullen was still standing there. What was more, a man was close beside her, and as I came up I heard her say indignantly, "I will not allow it. It is unfair to take advantage of me. Take your arm away, or I shall call for help." That was enough for me. One step carried my 160 pounds over the intervening ground, and, using the momentum of the stride to help, I put the flat of my hand against the shoulder of the man and gave him a shove. There are 3 or 4 Harvard men who can tell you what that means, and they were braced for it, which this fellow wasn't. He went staggering back as if struck by a cow catcher, and lay down on the ground, a good 15 feet away. His having his arm around Miss Cullen's waist unsteadied her so that she would have fallen too if I hadn't put my hand against her shoulder. I longed to put it about her, but by this time I didn't want to please myself, but to do only what I thought she would wish, and so restrained myself. Before I had time to finish an apology to Miss Cullen, the fellow was up on his feet, and came at me with an exclamation of anger. In my surprise at recognizing the voice as that of Lord Ralles, I almost neglected to take care of myself. But though he was quick with his fists, I caught him by the wrists as he closed, and he had no chance after that against a fellow of my weight. "Oh, don't quarrel!" cried Miss Cullen. Holding him, I said, "Lord Ralles, I overheard what Miss Cullen was saying, and supposing some man was insulting her, I acted as I did." Then I let go of him, and turning, I continued, "I am very sorry, Miss Cullen, if I did anything the circumstances did not warrant," while cursing myself for my precipitancy, and for not thinking that Miss Cullen would never have been caught in such a plight with a man unless she had been half willing, for a girl does not merely threaten to call for help if she really wants aid. Lord Ralles wasn't much mollified by my explanation. "You're too much in a hurry, my man," he growled, speaking to me as if I were a servant. "Be a bit more careful in the future." I think I should have retorted, for his manner was enough to make a saint mad, if Miss Cullen hadn't spoken. "You tried to help me, Mr. Gordon, and I am deeply grateful for that," she said. The words look simple enough set down here, but the tone in which she said them, and the extended hand and the grateful little squeeze she gave my fingers, all seemed to express so much that I was more puzzled over them than I was over the robbery. Chapter 4 of The Great K&A Train Robbery by Paul Lester Ford. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Some Rather Queer Road Agents. "You had better come back to the car, Miss Cullen," remarked Lord Ralles after a pause. But she declined to do so, saying she wanted to know what I was going to telegraph, and he left us, for which I wasn't sorry. I told her of the good news I had to send, and she wanted to know if now we could try to catch the road agents. I set her mind at rest on that score. "I think they'll give us very little trouble to bag," I added, "for they are so green that it's almost pitiful." "In not cutting the wires?" she asked. "In everything," I replied. "But the worst botch is their waiting till we had just passed the Arizona line. If they had held us up an hour earlier, it would only have been State's prison." "And what will it be now?" "Hanging." "What?" cried Miss Cullen. "In New Mexico train robbing is not capital, but in Arizona it is," I told her. "And if you catch them they'll be hung?" she asked. "Yes." "That seems very hard." The first signs of dawn were beginning to show by this time, and as the sky brightened, I told Miss Cullen that I was going to look for the trail of the fugitives. She said she would walk with me, if not in the way, and my assurance was very positive on that point. And here I want to remark that it's saying a good deal if a girl can be up all night in such excitement and still look fresh and pretty, and that she did. I ordered the crew to look about, and then began a big circle around the train. Finding nothing, I swung a bigger one. That being equally unavailing, I did a larger third. Not a trace of foot or hoof within a half mile of the cars. I had heard of blankets laid down to conceal a trail, of swathed feet, even of leathern horse boots with cattle hoofs on the bottom, but none of these could have been used for such a distance, let alone the entire absence of any signs of a place where the horses had been hobbled. Returning to the train, the report of the men was the same. "We've ghost road agents to deal with, Miss Cullen," I laughed. "They come from nowhere. Bullets touch them not. Their lead hurts nobody. They take nothing, and they disappear without touching the ground." "How curious it is!" she exclaimed. "One would almost suppose it a dream." "Hold on," I said. "We do have something tangible, for if they disappeared they left their shells behind them." And I pointed to some cartridge shells that lay on the ground beside the mail car. "My theory of aerial bullets won't do." "The shells are as hollow as I feel," laughed Miss Cullen. "Your suggestion reminds me that I am desperately hungry," I said. "Suppose we go back and end the famine." Most of the passengers had long since returned to their seats or berths, and Mr. Cullen's party had apparently done the same, for 218 showed no signs of life. One of my darkies was awake, and he broiled a steak and made us some coffee in no time, and just as they were ready Albert Cullen appeared, so we made a very jolly little breakfast. He told me at length the part he and the Britishers had borne, and only made me marvel the more that any one of them was alive, for apparently they had jumped off the car without the slightest precaution, and had stood grouped together, even after they had called attention to themselves by Lord Ralles's shots. Cullen had to confess that he heard the whistle of the 4 bullets unpleasantly close. "You have a right to be proud, Mr. Cullen," I said. "You fellows did a tremendously plucky thing, and thanks to you we didn't lose anything." "But you went to help too, Mr. Gordon," added Miss Cullen. That made me color up, and after a moment's hesitation I said, "I'm not going to sail under false colors, Miss Cullen. When I went forward I didn't think I could do anything. I supposed whoever had pitched into the robbers was dead, and I expected to be the same inside of 10 minutes." "Then why did you risk your life," she asked, "if you thought it was useless?" I laughed, and though ashamed to tell it, replied, "I didn't want you to think that the Britishers had more pluck than I had." She took my confession better than I hoped she would, laughing with me, and then said, "Well, that was courageous after all." "Yes," I confessed, "I was frightened into bravery." "Perhaps if they had known the danger as well as you, they would have been less courageous," she continued, and I could have blessed her for the speech. While we were still eating, the mail clerk came to my car, and reported that the most careful search had failed to discover the 3 registered letters, and they had evidently been taken. This made me feel sober, slight as the probable loss was. He told me that his list showed they were all addressed to Ash Forks, Arizona, making it improbable that their contents could be of any real value. If possible, I was more puzzled than ever. At 6:10 the runner whistled to show he had steam up. I told one of the brakemen to stay behind, and then went into 218. Mr. Cullen was still dressing, but I expressed my regrets through the door that I could not go with his party to the Grand Cañon, told him that all the stage arrangements had been completed, and promised to join him there in case my luck was good. Then I saw Frederic for a moment, to see how he was, for I had nearly forgotten him in the excitement, to find that he was gaining all the time, and preparing even to get up. When I returned to the saloon, the rest of the party were there, and I bade good bye to the captain and Albert. Then I turned to Lord Ralles, and holding out my hand, said, "Lord Ralles, I joked a little the other morning about the way you thought road agents ought to be treated. You have turned the joke very neatly and pluckily, and I want to apologize for myself and thank you for the railroad." "Neither is necessary," he retorted airily, pretending not to see my hand. I never claimed to have a good temper, and it was all I could do to hold myself in. I turned to Miss Cullen to wish her a pleasant trip, and the thought that this might be our last meeting made me forget even Lord Ralles. "I hope it isn't good bye, but only au revoir," she said. "Whether or no, you must let us see you some time in Chicago, so that I may show you how grateful I am for all the pleasure you have added to our trip." Then, as I stepped down off my platform, she leaned over the rail of 218 and added in a low voice, "I thought you were just as brave as the rest, Mr. Gordon, and now I think you are braver." I turned impulsively and said, "You would think so, Miss Cullen, if you knew the sacrifice I am making." Then, without looking at her, I gave the signal, the bell rang, and number 3 pulled off. The last thing I saw was a handkerchief waving off the platform of 218. When the train dropped out of sight over a grade, I swallowed the lump in my throat and went to the telegraph instrument. I wired Coolidge to give the alarm to Fort Wingate, Fort Apache, Fort Thomas, Fort Grant, Fort Bayard, and Fort Whipple, though I thought the precaution a mere waste of energy. Then I sent the brakeman up to connect the wire cut. "Two of the bullets struck up here, Mr. Gordon," the man called from the top of the pole. "Surely not!" I exclaimed. "Yes, sir," he responded. "The bullet holes are brand new." I took in the lay of the land, the embers of the fire showing me how the train had lain. "I don't wonder nobody was hit," I exclaimed, "if that's a sample of their shooting. Some one was a worse rattled man than I ever expect to be. Dig the bullets out, Douglas, so that we can have a look at them." He brought them down in a minute. They proved to be Winchesters, as I had expected, for they were on the side from which the robbers must have fired. "That chap must have been full of Arizona tanglefoot to have fired as wild as he did," I ejaculated, and walked over to where the mail car had stood, to see just how bad the shooting was. When I got there and faced about, it was really impossible to believe any man could have done so badly, for raising my own Winchester to the pole put it 20 degrees out of range and nearly 40 degrees in the air. Yet there were the cartridge shells on the ground to show that I was in the place from which the shots had been fired. While I was still cogitating over this, the special train I had ordered out from Flagstaff came in sight, and in a few moments was stopped where I was. It consisted of a string of 3 flats and a box car, and brought the sheriff, a dozen cowboys whom he had sworn in as deputies, and their horses. I was hopeful that with these fellows' greater skill in such matters they could find what I had not. But after a thorough examination of the ground within a mile of the robbery, they were as much at fault as I had been. "Them cusses must have a dugout nighabouts, for they couldn't have got away without wings," the sheriff surmised. I didn't put much stock in that idea, and told the sheriff so. "Wal, round up a better one," was his retort. Not being able to do that, I told him of the bullets in the telegraph pole, and took him over to where the mail car had stood. "Jerusalem crickets!" was his comment as he measured the aim. "If that's where they put 2 of their pills, they must have pumped the other 4 into the moon." "What other 4?" I asked. "Shots," he replied sententiously. "The road agents only fired 4 times," I told him. "Them and your pards must have been pretty nigh together for a minute then," he said, pointing to the ground. I glanced down, and sure enough there were 6 empty cartridge shells. I stood looking blankly at them, hardly able to believe what I saw, for Albert Cullen had said distinctly that the train robbers had fired only 4 times, and that the last 3 Winchester shots I had heard had been fired by himself. Then, without speaking, I walked slowly back, searching along the edge of the road bed for more shells; but though I went beyond the point where the last car had stood, not one did I find. Any man who has fired a Winchester knows that it drops its empty shell in loading, and I could therefore draw only one conclusion, namely, that all 7 discharges of the Winchesters had occurred up by the mail car. I had heard of men supposing they had fired their guns through hearing another go off, but with a repeating rifle one has to fire before one can reload. The fact was evident that Albert Cullen either had fired his Winchester up by the mail car, or else had not fired it at all. In either case he had lied, and Lord Ralles and Captain Ackland had backed him up in it. Chapter 5 of the Great K&A Train Robbery by Paul Lester Ford. Chapter 5 A Trip to the Grand Cañon. I stood pondering, for no explanation that would fit the facts seemed possible. I should have considered the young fellow's story only an attempt to gain a little reputation for pluck, if in any way I could have accounted for the appearance and disappearance of the robbers. Yet to suppose which seemed the only other horn to the dilemma that the son and guests of the vice president of the Missouri Western and one of our own directors would be concerned in train robbery was to believe something equally improbable. Indeed, I should have put the whole thing down as a practical joke of Mr. Cullen's party, if it had not been for the loss of the registered letters. Even a practical joker would hardly care to go to the length of cutting open government mail pouches, for Uncle Sam doesn't approve of such conduct. Whatever the explanation, I had enough facts to prevent me from wasting more time on that alkali plain. Getting the men and horses back onto the cars, I jumped up on the tailboard and ordered the runner to pull out for Flagstaff. It was a run of 7 hours, getting us in a little after 8, and in those hours I had done a lot of thinking, which had all come to one result, that Mr. Cullen's party was concerned in the hold up. The 2 private cars were on a siding, but the Cullens had left for the Grand Cañon the moment they had arrived, and were about reaching there by this time. I went to 218 and questioned the cook and waiter, but they had either seen nothing or else had been primed, for not a fact did I get from them. Going to my own car, I ordered a quick supper, and while I was eating it I questioned my boy. He told me that he had heard the shots, and had bolted the front door of my car, as I had ordered when I went out; that as he turned to go to a safer place he had seen a man, revolver in hand, climb over the off side gate of Mr. Cullen's car, and for a moment he had supposed it a road agent, till he saw that it was Albert Cullen. "That was just after I had got off?" I asked. "Then it couldn't have been Mr. Cullen, Jim," I declared, "for I found him up at the other end of the car." "Tell you it was, Mr. Gordon," Jim insisted. "I done seen his face clar in de light, and he done go into Mr. Cullen's car where de old gentleman was sitting." That set me whistling to myself, and I laughed to think how near I had come to giving nitroglycerin to a fellow who was only shamming heart failure. For that it was Frederic Cullen who had climbed on the car I hadn't the slightest doubt, the resemblance between the 2 brothers being quite strong enough to deceive any one who had never seen them together. I smiled a little, and remarked to myself, "I think I can make good my boast that I would catch the robbers. But whether the Cullens will like my doing it, I question. What is more, Lord Ralles will owe me a bottle." Then I thought of Madge, and didn't feel as pleased over my success as I had felt a moment before. By 9 o'clock the posse and I were in the saddle and skirting the San Francisco peaks. There was no use of pressing the ponies, for our game wasn't trying to escape, and, for that matter, couldn't, as the Colorado River wasn't passable within 50 miles. It was a lovely moonlit night, and the ride through the pines was as pretty a one as I remember ever to have made. It set me thinking of Madge and of our talk the evening before, and of what a change 24 hours had brought. It was lucky I was riding an Indian pony, or I should probably have landed in a heap. I don't know that I should have cared particularly if a prairie dog burro had made me dash my brains out, for I wasn't happy over the job that lay before me. We watered at Silver Spring at 12:15. From that point we were clear of the pines and out on the plain, so we could go a better pace. This brought us to the halfway ranch by 2, where we gave the ponies a feed and an hour's rest. We reached the last relay station just as the moon set, about 3:40, and as all the rest of the ride was through Coconino Forest, we held up there for daylight, getting a little sleep meanwhile. We rode into the camp at the Grand Cañon a little after 8, and the deserted look of the tents gave me a moment's fright, for I feared that the party had gone. Tolfree explained, however, that some had ridden out to Moran Point, and that the rest had gone down Hance's trail. So I breakfasted, and then took a look at Albert Cullen's Winchester. That it had been recently fired was as plain as the Grand Cañon itself. Throwing back the bar, I found an empty cartridge shell, still oily from the discharge. That completed the tale of 7 shots. I didn't feel absolutely safe till I had asked Tolfree if there had been any shooting of echoes by the party, but his denial rounded out my chain of evidence. Telling the sheriff to guard the bags of the party carefully, I took 2 of the posse and rode over to Moran's Point. Sure enough, there were Mr. Cullen, Albert, and Captain Ackland. They gave a shout at seeing me, and even before I had reached them they called to know how I could come so soon, and if I had caught the robbers. Mr. Cullen started to tell his pleasure at my rejoining the party, but my expression made him pause, and it seemed to dawn on all 3 that the Winchester across my saddle, and the cowboys' hands resting nonchalantly on the revolvers in their belts, had a meaning. "Mr. Cullen," I explained, "I've got a very unpleasant job on hand, which I don't want to make any worse than need be. Every fact points to your party as guilty of holding up the train last night and stealing those letters. Probably you weren't all concerned, but I've got to go on the assumption that you were all guilty till you prove otherwise." "Aw, you're joking," drawled Albert. "I hope so," I said, "but for the present I've got to be English and treat the joke seriously." "What do you want to do?" asked Mr. Cullen. "I don't wish to arrest you gentlemen unless you force me to," I said, "for I don't see that it will do any good. But I want you to return to camp with us." They assented to that, and single file we rode back. When there I told each that he must be searched, to which they submitted at once. After that we went through their baggage. I wasn't going to have the sheriff or cowboys tumbling over Miss Cullen's clothes, so I looked over her bag myself. The prettiness and daintiness of the various contents were a revelation to me, and I tried to put them back as neatly as I had found them; but I didn't know much about the articles, and it was a terrible job trying to fold up some of the things. Why, there was a big pink affair, lined with silk, with bits of ribbon and lace all over it, which nearly drove me out of my head, for I would have defied mortal man to pack it so that it shouldn't muss. I had a funny little feeling of tenderness for everything, which made fussing over it all a pleasure, even while I felt all the time that I was doing a sneak act and had really no right to touch her belongings. I didn't find anything incriminating, and the posse reported the same result with the other baggage. If the letters were still in existence they were either concealed somewhere, or were in the possession of the party in the cañon. Telling the sheriff to keep those in the camp under absolute surveillance, I took a single man, and, saddling a couple of mules, started down the trail. We found Frederick and Captain Hance just dismounting at the rock cabin, and I told the former he was in custody for the present, and asked him where Miss Cullen and Lord Ralles were. He told me they were just behind, but I wasn't going to take any risks, and ordering the deputy to look after Cullen, I went on down the trail. I couldn't resist calling back, "How's your respiration, Mr. Cullen?" He laughed and called, "Digitalis put me on my feet like a flash." "He's got the most brains of any man in this party," I remarked to myself. The trail at this point is very winding, so that one can rarely see 50 feet in advance, and sometimes not 10. Owing to this, the first thing I knew I plumped round a curve onto a mule, which was patiently standing there. Just back of him was another, on which sat Miss Cullen, and standing close beside her was Lord Ralles. One of his hands held the mule's bridle, the other held Madge's arm, and he was saying, "You owe it to me, and I will have one, or if—" I swore to myself and coughed aloud, which made Miss Cullen look up. The moment she saw me she cried, "Mr. Gordon, how delightful!" even while she grew as red as she had been pale the moment before. Lord Ralles grew red too, but in a different way. "Have you caught the robbers?" cried Miss Cullen. "I'm afraid I have," I answered. "What do you mean?" she asked. I smiled at the absolute innocence and wonder with which she spoke, and replied, "I know now, Miss Cullen, why you said I was braver than the Britishers." "How do you know?" I couldn't resist getting in a side shot at Lord Ralles, who had mounted his mule and sat scowling. "The train robbers were such thoroughgoing duffers at the trade," I said, "that if they had left their names and addresses they wouldn't have made it much easier. We Americans may not know enough to deal with real road agents, but we can do something with amateurs." "What are we stopping here for?" demanded Lord Ralles. "I'm sure I don't know," I responded. "Miss Cullen, if you will kindly pass us, and then if Lord Ralles will follow you, we will go on to the cabin. I must ask you to keep close together." "I stay or go as I please, and not by your orders," asserted Lord Ralles snappishly. "Out in this part of the country," I said calmly, "it is considered shocking bad form for an unarmed man to argue with one who carries a repeating rifle. Kindly follow Miss Cullen." And leaning over, I struck his mule with the loose ends of my bridle, starting it up the trail. When we reached the cabin the deputy told me that he had made Frederick strip and had searched his clothing, finding nothing. I ordered Lord Ralles to dismount and go into the cabin. "For what?" he demanded. "We want to search you," I answered. "I don't choose to be searched," he protested. "You have shown no warrant nor—" I wasn't in a mood towards him to listen to his talk. I swung my Winchester into line and announced, "I was sworn in last night as a deputy sheriff, and am privileged to shoot a train robber on sight. Either dead or alive, I'm going to search your clothing inside of 10 minutes, and if you have no preference as to whether the examination is an ante or post mortem affair, I certainly haven't." That brought him down off his high horse, that is, mule, and I sent the deputy in with him with directions to toss his clothes out to me, for I wanted to keep my eye on Miss Cullen and her brother, so as to prevent any legerdemain on their part. One by one the garments came flying through the door to me. As fast as I finished examining them I pitched them back, Except well, as I have thought it over since then, I have decided that I did a mean thing and have regretted it. But just put yourself in my place, and think of how Lord Ralles had talked to me as if I was his servant, had refused my apology and thanks, and been as generally nasty as he could, and perhaps you won't blame me that after looking through his trousers I gave them a toss which, instead of sending them back into the hut, sent them over the edge of the trail. They went down 600 feet before they lodged in a poplar, and if his lordship followed the trail he could get round to them, but there would then be 100 feet of sheer rock between the trail and the trousers. I hope it will teach him to study his Lord Chesterfield to better purpose, for if politeness doesn't cost anything, rudeness can cost considerable, I chuckled to myself. My amusement did not last long, for my next thought was, if those letters are concealed on any one, they are on Miss Cullen. The thought made me lean up against my mule and turn hot and cold by turns. A nice situation for a lover. Chapter 6